Dawn came grudging over West Texas. Wind pressed through the busted blades of dry Comet well and sang in a thin metal key. The air tasted like old pennies. Somewhere beyond the low mesas a shot cracked, then the far bark of hounds unraveled across the flats. Nora Calloway ran until her feet stopped listening. Gravel chewed her soles, a strip of cloth stuck to her shoulder where the bullet had kissed and left heat. Breath burned. Each inhale scraped raw, each exhale salted her mouth. When her legs faltered, she caught herself on a mesquite trunk, then saw the grave beneath it. The name pressed into weathered wood, June Brandt. A loop of wildflowers lay at the base, not yet brittle. Someone had been here this week. The cabin beyond looked like the landscape had grown it. Sun-faded boards, a low porch door left a thumb's width open. Silence lived around it. No chickens, no bucket on the rail, no ash in the yard. Only a thin drift of footprints she could not read. Her fingers stuck to the hot latch. The door moved with a slow complaint. Inside a different world. Floors swept a narrow bed made tight, a patchwork quilt folded square. A black iron stove with a clean ash pan. On the table a daguerreotype in a tin frame, two faces in silver light. A woman with kind eyes, a man with a tired jaw. Beside it a Colt revolver oiled to a dull glow, and a hymn book leather soft with years margins packed with neat handwriting. Verses underlined questions in tiny script arrows pointing from one psalm to another. A small brass star rode between the pages, no bigger than a thumb, as if someone had used it to save their place. Nora set her fingertips on the star, cool metal. Her hand shook, then steadied. She flipped to the back. The last note ended with a crooked line that crossed the gutter and vanished into the binding. She felt the board through the leather. Stiff, too stiff. A floorboard answered when she shifted her weight. Hollow. The sound lifted the hair on her arms. She went to her knees and pressed along the board's edge. It rose with less effort than she expected. The space beneath held a city in miniature. 2 canteens wrapped in canvas, a tin of crackers, a roll of gauze, a bottle with brown liquid, and a cork. A stack of folded dresses, different sizes, different shades, cotton and calico. Also a bundle of letters tied with twine tucked hard into the corner. Horses. She heard them far off, a steady beat, not the ragged charge of men who chase for pleasure. She took a canteen, a plain dress, the bottle. The first swallow hit her throat and flared like fire, then gave way to cool. Her mouth stopped tasting like metal. The hoofbeats grew louder. Spurs chimed on wood. Nora slid into the dark, lowered. The board found a narrow seam of light between 2 planks. A shoe scuffed. Dust stirred. The door hinges settled, then quiet. Boots crossed the room, slower now. Patient, the kind of patient that comes from long practice. The sound stopped at the bed. A shift. The soft spit of a thumb on a cloth, the click of a cylinder closing. The man spoke without hurry. "Dust says someone came in. Dust says she is still here." The board above her lifted. Light poured in white and hard. The face that looked down had a scar that started at the temple and disappeared into a salt and pepper beard. His eyes were gray, steady like river stones you could not move with a boot. The Colt did not tremble. "Please," Nora said. Her voice cracked at the edges. "If you give me back, shoot me first." "I do not shoot women," he said. "I do not give them up on my ground either." He stepped back and kept the barrel on line. Nora climbed up. The room tilted, then steadied. He took in her dress, ripped to threads the dirt, the blood that had crusted brown around the torn shoulder. The gun vanished into a worn holster in one breath. In the next he had a drawer open and a bottle in his hand. "Sit," he said, pointing at the chair. "This will bite." He soaked a cloth and pressed it to her wound. Fire burned under her skin and shot down her arm. Her jaw closed on a sound and made a different one. The smell rose biting and clean. Sweat ran cold along her neck. "It is not just for pain," he said. "This heat rots quick." He worked with a mechanic's calm. Hands calloused, movements small. The bandage lay flat in seconds. The man's face stayed unreadable. "You were a doctor," she said. "Elias Brandt," he answered. "Was." He tore a strip from the hem of a clean pillowcase and tied the bandage off. Outside, the wind swung and another sound slid into the room. Hounds again thinner now. The pursuit had missed a turn, or the creek had stolen her scent for a mile. The man crossed to the window and looked through a crack in the curtain without moving anything else. His shoulders tightened. He set his hat on his head, checked the Colt, and stepped out. "Stay quiet," he said. "If I do not return, take water and whatever you can carry from under the floor. There is a roan mare out back. North is the only direction that matters." Nora eased to the window. The man stood on the porch and folded himself into a shape that looked loose until you looked harder. The morning was too bright. 3 riders cut a line toward the cabin with hounds on leads. The one in front wore a black coat that did not belong in this heat. He took his time dismounting. A hand rose a courteous greeting with no warmth in it. The hounds planted their feet and strained. Nash called her. Nora whispered into the room's quiet. She had heard the name in kitchens and back rooms in the courthouse hall where women measured their steps. A bounty hunter who did not miss. Brant, Nash called. You keep odd company. Company comes and goes, Elias answered. Looking for a red-haired woman, 30 or thereabout. Shot a judge in El Paso County and left with paperwork that does not belong to her. Poster says murder. Reward says generous. No one passes Dry Comet if they can help it, Elias said. You know that. Nash's smile did not include his eyes. Mind if I look around all the same? I mind, Elias said. Silence settled. The hounds whined. Nash let his gaze drift past the porch rail toward the mesquite and the grave. It lingered there, then moved to the riser where Nora had stumbled and left a smear of brown on gray wood. His eyes paused. He did not say a word about it. You were good in the war, Nash said, voice low enough that the words almost did not leave the porch. You put people back together. Everyone finds a way to live, after Elias said. Nash slipped a folded paper from his coat and held it between 2 fingers. If she wanders through, tell her the law is kinder than the desert. He let the paper hang without crossing the line. Or maybe I will tell her myself. I told you this is my ground, Elias said. Your ground, Nash said, like he agreed. Your rules. He touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat and turned. The hounds pulled. Dust rose in ropes under hooves. The riders angled away toward the dry creek bed and were gone. Elias came back in and set the paper on the table between them. Nora stared at her own face, hard lines in cheap ink. The word looked bigger than the picture. Murder. He is not wrong that the desert will kill you without help, Elias said. I did not kill my husband, Nora said. The words had traveled too far in her mouth. They sounded thin now. Most people say they did not, Elias said. He did not put weight on the doubt. He went to the stove and poured coffee black enough to shine. He gave her a cup and let the steam climb. Thank you, she said. Do not thank me for coffee, he said. Drink. The first swallow made her tongue curl, then cleared the last train of dust from her throat. The mug warmed both her hands. She felt the cabin's clean edges. A back door with a chained latch. A set of nails by the stove holding a pair of scissors, a length of twine, a tin of matches lined up like soldiers. The hymn book on the table with its crowd of notes. In the frame, June Brant was still smiling, head bent toward the man beside her, like he had said something gentle. Nora touched the edge of the book again. The brass star within glinted in a thin knife of light. She slid it out and turned it between her fingers. The points were blunt. Someone had handled it often. June liked to mark things, Elias said. Songs, pages, paths. Who taught you to hide a cellar in a floor, Nora asked. June, he said. He took the star from her, held it a second, then set it back on the open page. He watched the window the whole time. Outside, the light had a harsh whiteness that meant noon would come early. The wind shifted and brought the smell of something that lived far and traveled fast. Creosote and dog and the smoke of a cook fire miles away. Nora swallowed and felt the bandage pull under her collarbone. She looked at the hidden trap in the floor, the dresses folded like small, quiet promises. The space had not been dug for her. It had been dug for any woman with nowhere to go. You have a name you prefer, Elias said. Nora Calloway, she answered. Nora Price is what the courthouse used. He nodded. He did not ask what the courthouse used it for. A shadow crossed the window. Not a man, just a hawk cutting a silent angle above the yard. The glare softened a fraction. Somewhere to the south a dog barked once then again clipped short. Elias refilled her cup and took his own seat by the window. He rested the revolver on his thigh. He did not say he would stay awake. He did not promise anything. The room remembered him doing this before. His breath fell into a pattern with the wind and the slow creak of wood that had learned these sounds. On the porch step, the smear of Nora's blood had dried to a faint rust. The paper on the table lifted in the current and settled again. The brass star winked once and went dull. Far off the hounds found their voices. Not close, not far. Elias listened until the sound faded to a line you could mistake for wind if you wanted to. He did not move. He did not blink. Outside, the well's blades turned one careful inch. The air shifted and brought the faint ring of metal against leather from somewhere beyond the flats. Nora held her breath and tasted iron again. The cabin waited. The day held, and the wind kept changing. The sun arced higher and the desert floor grew sharper hotter. Elias sat by the window, his back turned toward Nora, but his eyes never stopped scanning the horizon. She had the sense he was listening to something invisible, a rhythm only he could hear. She finished the coffee, the bitterness now familiar, and set the cup down the wood of the table cold under her fingers. Nora didn't know how much longer she could stay here, how long she could exist in this strange, unspoken silence. Her body ached with more than just the bullet wound. She felt the weight of the past pressing her shoulders, a life she had lived so carefully, so quietly, only to have it shattered in a single night. She couldn't stay in Elias's cabin forever, couldn't let herself be swallowed by it. Her eyes flicked to the door, to the glint of sunlight pressing through the thin crack. Somewhere beyond it, men were looking for her. She could feel it in the very air, the way the earth trembled beneath the weight of things unsaid. The hounds would catch her scent again. She knew this as certainly as she knew how to breathe. Elias stood slow and measured, as if the day were moving at a pace it had chosen for itself. He crossed the room without a word, then stopped just short of the door. He didn't need to say anything. She saw the gun on his hip, the Colt that was still warm from the ride earlier, and she felt a sickening familiarity with it. It was a reminder of a life she had wanted to leave behind. "I'll need to check the creek bed," Elias said, his voice low, carrying none of the urgency that churned inside her. "Stay inside. I don't want any more dust on the porch than necessary." Nora nodded without answering. She knew it wasn't just the creek bed that called to him, it was the land itself. He didn't need to chase her scent to know it was only a matter of time before the hounds found their way here. He didn't ask her about her past or her choices, but in the space between words, she could feel the question pressing against the walls, waiting for its turn. She turned away from him as he stepped out. The dust on the floor still held his shape, his presence, as if it were trying to keep him close. She didn't know what he was to her, what he could be. A protector, perhaps, though she had not earned his protection. A stranger who had a wife, a life that had died long before Nora's problems ever found her. She didn't dare to look at the photograph again, not now. Instead, she forced her gaze to the Bible open on the table. June Brandt's handwriting danced on the page, neat and purposeful. Nora's eyes skimmed the words, absorbing their rhythm, their intent. A thought prickled at the edge of her mind. June had known things. About the land, about the world she had built, about people. She had made a safe space for those who had nowhere to go. Nora pushed back the creeping feeling that she was trespassing in someone else's life. She was here now, and that meant something. It had to. There was no turning back. The hours passed, marked only by the stillness of the cabin, the wind shifting with a quiet groan through the cracks in the walls. The sound of Elias's footsteps on the porch came back and faded again, each time a little further away. She didn't know if he would return before the hounds found her trail. And then it came, the distant rhythm of hooves. She felt it before she heard it, a pulse under her skin. She grabbed the rifle from the shelf. It was heavy, untested in her hands, but it gave her something to hold on to, something to control. She stepped to the window, heart hammering in her chest as she peered through the slats. The riders weren't who she expected. They moved with purpose, not like bounty hunters or lawmen, but something else. Something worse. Their horses were fresh, their movements deliberate. There was no hurry in them, just an awareness. They knew where they were going. The door cracked open just as the wind carried the low mutter of a voice, Elias's voice. She couldn't hear the words, but the tone was familiar, flat, controlled, the kind that had kept him alive for years. Nora took one step back, then froze. Something in her bones told her it was too late to hide, too late to run. The door swung wide. 3 men stood in the threshold, the light from the afternoon sun throwing sharp shadows around their bodies. Their faces were hard and unfamiliar, each one carrying an air of purpose that stank of trouble. "We've been looking for you," one of them said, the words slow measured. "Word is you're worth more alive than dead, but that's a matter of perspective." The man's hand drifted to his gun. The others mirrored him, eyes never leaving Nora. The leader's eyes narrowed, a smile flickering over his face. He didn't move fast, but she could see the danger in the way his fingers tapped against the grip of his revolver. Elias stepped into the doorway just behind them, his hand resting easy on his own gun. He said nothing at first, just watched the men, his eyes cold and still. "Thought you might show up," he said at last, the words hanging heavy in the air. He stepped forward, blocking the door. "But this is my land. You don't cross it unless I say so." The man smiled wider, but this time it was a sneer. "I'm not here for a lesson in manners, Brandt. You've got someone we need, and we're not leaving without her." The tension thickened like a fog. Nora could feel it pressing down on her chest, squeezing her lungs until the air felt heavy. She took a slow, shallow breath, wondering if she had the strength to hold on any longer. She couldn't make a sound, couldn't move, as the weight of the situation crushed everything around her. Elias didn't flinch. His hand didn't leave the gun, and for a long moment it seemed as though the world itself had come to a standstill. The silence was broken by the sound of the horses behind them, their hooves clattering against the parched earth. A new threat had arrived too close. She knew it. She wasn't alone anymore. The stillness in the cabin grew thick like the world had stopped turning for just a moment. The three men at the door lingered, their boots heavy on the dry wooden floorboards. Their eyes were trained on Elias, then flicked to Nora, who was now standing just behind him, the rifle in her hands trembling ever so slightly. The leader of the men was the first to move, taking a step forward, his boots dragging the dust across the threshold. He looked like a man who had seen too much of the world and enjoyed none of it. His face was a landscape of scars and hard lines, and his eyes, pale and sharp, never left Nora's. "You think you can stand in the way of this?" he asked Elias, his voice low and dangerous. "We don't want trouble, Brant, just the woman, and we'll be on our way." He held up a hand, signaling his men to stay back. The gesture was both calm and calculating. He knew that any sudden move could escalate things, but he wasn't about to back down. Elias didn't flinch. His hand rested easily on his holstered revolver, the leather worn from years of use. He didn't need to speak. His silence spoke volumes, a quiet assertion that this land, his land, was sacred to him, and it wouldn't be taken lightly. "I said no," Elias replied, his tone even without hesitation. The man's smile twisted. He took another slow step forward, almost daring Elias to make a move. "You think you can hold your ground out here?" he said, his voice rising slightly. "We're not just some bounty hunters, Brant. We have orders, and we're not leaving without her." Nora could feel her pulse in her throat. She stood there clutching the rifle, her thoughts racing. She didn't know who these men were or how they had found her, but she could see the hard edge in their eyes. They had come prepared, and she could feel the walls closing in. The room felt smaller, the space between them all shrinking. She glanced at Elias, his stance unwavering, his eyes fixed on the leader. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about Elias too, his history, his promises, his resolve. The man with the scar eyed her again, sizing her up. His gaze lingered on the rifle in her hands, the tremor in her fingers. He could see the fear, but he didn't acknowledge it, not yet. "You don't look like a killer," he said with a faint chuckle. "But we all have our reasons, don't we?" Elias's voice cut through the air, sharp and cold. "That's enough," he said, stepping forward, closing the gap between them. "You want her? You'll have to go through me." The silence that followed was like a held breath waiting to be released. The man with the scar didn't move for a moment, his eyes narrowing. There was a subtle shift in his expression, something that flickered behind his cold gaze. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but it was caution. He recognized Elias for what he was, a man who had seen war, who had fought and survived it, and men like that were dangerous. He glanced back at his two companions, who remained still, watching the scene unfold. The tension in the air was palpable, but it wasn't enough to make the man back off. He was calculating, watching for any sign of weakness, a single misstep. "Let's make this easy," the leader said, his voice smoother now, almost coaxing. "You don't have to die for her, Brant. This doesn't have to end in bloodshed." But Elias didn't soften, didn't budge. "I said no." He repeated his words, simple but final. The leader studied him for another beat, then sighed. "I warned you," he muttered, then nodded to his men. They were quick, moving like shadows, surrounding the cabin. One of them pushed past the leader, making his way toward the door, the gun in his hand gleaming coldly in the sunlight. Nora's heart thudded in her chest. This was it. The moment where everything she had feared would come crashing down. She didn't know what to do. Her body wanted to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. And Elias, he wasn't going to back down. The man at the door raised his weapon, aiming at Elias's chest. His hand was steady, but his eyes flickered with doubt. Just as he pulled the trigger, something unexpected happened. A shot rang out sharp and loud. The man at the door collapsed, his gun clattering to the floor. The air seemed to freeze for a split second. The other two men, confused, spun around to see where the shot had come from. Standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the harsh sunlight, was a familiar figure. A man who wore the same dust-streaked duster and heavy boots, but with a look in his eyes that had changed since the last time Nora had seen him. It was Nash Calder. Nora's heart skipped a beat. She had expected him to be her enemy, the one who would hunt her down and drag her back. But here he was, standing between her and the men who were about to kill Elias. He glanced quickly at Elias, then at the two remaining men, his gun still raised. "I told you I didn't like the odds," Nash said, his voice a dry drawl. "I don't make a habit of saving lives, but you're making it difficult for me to stay out of this." The two men hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. Their leader, though, just scowled, his grip tightening on his revolver. "Don't think you've won!" The leader spat, his voice laced with venom. "This won't be over." Nash's eyes narrowed, but he didn't move. "You've already lost," he said simply. The tension in the cabin evaporated just enough for Nora to breathe again, though her heart still pounded in her chest. She couldn't believe what had just happened. Nash Calder, the bounty hunter who had been hunting her, was now standing on her side. The leader sneered one last time before nodding to his men. "We'll finish this later," he muttered. With a last look at the cabin, he turned and motioned for the others to follow. They retreated into the desert, leaving Elias and Nora standing in the quiet aftermath. Nash didn't lower his weapon immediately. His gaze flicked over to Nora, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes, something that wasn't just calculation or coldness. "You all right?" he asked her, his voice rough, but not unkind. Nora nodded slowly, still trying to catch her breath. "I thought you were after me," she said, her voice shaky. "Why are you helping?" Nash looked at Elias, then back at her. "I've been hunting for the wrong reasons," he said simply before holstering his gun. "And I know exactly who you're running from. I don't owe them a damn thing." He stepped aside, allowing Elias and Nora to breathe easier, though he stayed close enough to keep watch. Elias finally let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He looked at Nash, then at Nora, and for the first time there was something softer in his eyes. Not warmth, but something like understanding. Maybe even a kind of reluctant respect. "This doesn't change anything," Elias said, though his tone was less harsh than before. "Maybe," Nash replied, "but it sure makes the road a hell of a lot easier to travel." Nora didn't know what to say. She only knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't facing it alone. The desert air felt colder now, despite the sun burning fiercely overhead. The tension that had nearly snapped in the cabin was still there, hovering just below the surface. But it was different now, shifting, uncertain. The men had retreated, but they hadn't forgotten, and Nora knew it was only a matter of time before they returned with reinforcements. Elias stood by the door, his hand still resting on the revolver at his hip, his expression unreadable. Nash had already moved toward the window, his eyes scanning the horizon, though his posture was far more relaxed than it had been earlier. "You should get moving," Nash said, his voice low but firm. "I can't keep them off you forever." Nora didn't know what to say to that. She'd never been the kind of person to rely on someone else, certainly not a bounty hunter who had been hunting her only days before. But something in Nash's eyes told her that he wasn't going to leave her high and dry. Not this time. "We can't stay here," Elias muttered, breaking the silence. His voice held the kind of finality that seemed to settle in the room like a heavy weight. "They'll be back before nightfall. You'd be fools to think otherwise." Nora knew he was right, though it didn't make the idea of leaving any easier. This cabin had been a kind of refuge, a brief moment of safety in a world that had never offered her much. But the world outside hadn't changed. The hounds were still on her trail. The men would still come, and there was nothing Elias or Nash could do to stop that. "We need a plan," Elias continued, turning his gaze toward Nora, "and we need it fast." Nash didn't turn from the window, but his voice was steady. "You won't make it past the border if we don't change your appearance. The men who are hunting you know you. They'll be looking for a woman with copper hair and a face like yours. The moment you show your face, they'll find you." Nora swallowed hard. Her hand clenched around the rifle as if it could somehow shield her from the inevitable. "You're right," she said quietly. "But where do we go from here? I can't hide forever. And even if I run, what happens when I get caught?" Elias took a step forward, his eyes meeting hers. "I can get you across the border, but you need to disappear. For good." Nora's heart twisted. She hadn't planned on running forever. She hadn't planned on losing everything, on becoming a ghost in a world that had already forgotten her existence. Nash finally turned from the window, his gaze flicking between the two of them. "It won't be easy," he said, his voice calm. "But you've got a better chance of surviving if we get to Denver. There's someone there, someone who can help. A man named Marshall Harrison. He's been fighting Reed and his network for a while now. If you get those documents to him, you might be able to bring the whole damn thing down." Nora's pulse quickened at the mention of Denver. The name carried weight, a faint glimmer of hope in the haze of uncertainty, but she couldn't let herself get distracted. "And if they find me before we get there?" "We'll deal with that when it happens," Elias said, his voice as hard as the rock that jutted out from the desert floor. "But you have to trust me, Nora. Trust us. You're not alone in this anymore." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that this wasn't just another lie, another empty promise in a world that never delivered on its assurances. But the years of her life had taught her not to trust people too easily, not to let down her guard. And yet, in this moment, with everything on the line, she felt the smallest flicker of something that might have been trust. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Okay, we'll go to Denver, but we leave now. No more waiting." Nash gave a curt nod, then looked toward Elias. "We can't stay on this road much longer. They'll be back by nightfall, and they won't be alone. We'll take the back way out through the old mining routes. It'll be rough, but it's our best shot." Elias gave a slight nod, his gaze hardening. "Lead the way." Nora, despite herself, felt a small sense of relief settle over her. For the first time in a long time, the weight of the world didn't feel so heavy. She was still terrified, still uncertain, but at least she wasn't walking into the unknown alone. The three of them gathered their things, Elias taking his revolver, Nash checking his rifle, and Nora packing the few belongings she had left into a small satchel. They moved quietly, as if the very air itself were waiting for them to make the wrong move. As they stepped out into the heat of the desert, the wind swept across the land in sharp gusts, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and the promise of what was to come. Nora felt the weight of the documents hidden in her satchel, Jacob's ledgers, his records, his dark legacy. They were the only thing that could bring down the powerful men who had destroyed so many lives. They were her only chance for redemption. But they were also the reason she was running. Nash led the way, his steps sure and steady. Elias fell in behind him, his eyes scanning the horizon with practiced caution. Nora followed, trying to ignore the sound of her own heartbeat, the clinking of the rifle as it bounced against her back. It wasn't long before they reached the old mining path, the one that wound through the jagged cliffs and the deep crevices of the desert. It was narrow, treacherous, but it offered them a chance to slip past the hunters who were sure to be looking for them. They pressed on the sun dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the desolate land. The heat was still oppressive, but it was nothing compared to the weight of the future they were rushing toward. Nora couldn't see the end of the road yet, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that there might be one. A way out, a way forward. They walked in silence, the only sounds the crunch of their boots on the dry earth and the faint whisper of the wind as it brushed through the desert. And as the light from the setting sun painted the land in blood-red hues, Nora couldn't shake the feeling that whatever came next, it would be the beginning of the end. The desert was quieter now, the sun dipping lower, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch forever across the barren land. The wind whispered through the cracks in the earth, stirring the dust as it blew. The weight of the day was pressing down on them, but they kept moving, one foot in front of the other, as if there was nothing else in the world but the journey ahead. Nora walked beside Elias and Nash, her mind still racing with everything that had happened. They hadn't spoken much since they'd left the cabin. The quiet seemed to press in on them from all sides, the vastness of the desert making them feel smaller, more vulnerable. But there was something about it that gave her a strange sense of calm, too. The emptiness, the distance from the chaos that had defined her life for so long. The further they got from that place, the lighter she felt. Even though the road ahead was uncertain, the fear that had gripped her chest for so long was starting to loosen its hold. They'd reached the border, the final stretch. The landscape had shifted from barren desert to jagged rocks, towering cliffs, and the hint of something greener in the distance. This was it, the last obstacle before they could leave the territory and find some semblance of safety. Nash stopped suddenly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His hand was on the rifle slung across his back, but his stance was more relaxed than it had been in days. "We're close," he said, his voice low but steady. "We need to make sure we stay off the main roads. The hunters will be expecting us. But if we can get through these hills, we'll be in the clear." Elias nodded, his eyes scanning the ridge ahead. He wasn't saying much, but the tension in his posture had eased slightly. The journey was nearing its end, and with it the weight of the past few days. The constant fight for survival, the uncertainty. It all felt like it was slipping away, like the horizon ahead was a line of freedom. But Nora knew it wasn't over yet. They still had to cross the border. They still had to get to Denver and get the documents to the right people. She couldn't afford to think too much about what would happen after. There were too many unknowns, too much at stake. "We can't stop now," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "Not until we're across. Not until I'm free." Nash gave her a quick glance, his expression unreadable. "You're right. We keep moving." They pressed on, climbing the steep hills that led to the border. The path was narrow, rocky, and treacherous, but they were used to the harsh conditions by now. The air was thin at the higher elevations, and Nora could feel the burn in her legs as they ascended, but she didn't stop. There was no time to stop. As they reached the top of the ridge, a shadow fell across them. The first stars of the evening were beginning to show twinkling faintly in the sky. For a moment, everything felt still. The wind had died down, and the only sounds were their breaths, ragged and quick from the climb. Then a distant rumble. Nora's heart skipped a beat. She looked at Elias, then at Nash. The tension between them all was palpable. Something was wrong. Before any of them could react, the sound grew louder. Hoofbeats, dozens of them. "They're coming," Elias muttered, his voice grim. "They've found us." Nash pulled his rifle from his back, his movements precise, calculated. He didn't hesitate. "Get ready, we don't have much time." Nora's heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't sure if it was the exhaustion, the fear, or something else, maybe a mixture of both. But her body was already moving before she realized it. She crouched low behind the rocks, the rifle tight in her hands, the weight of it oddly comforting. Elias and Nash took their positions, covering the approach. The sound of hooves grew louder, closer. Nora could see the shadows of riders now, their outlines barely visible in the fading light. She had to make sure she didn't get caught, didn't let them find her before she crossed that line. She couldn't go back, not after everything. The first rider appeared around the bend, followed by two more. Their horses were strong, their riders hardened by years of chasing people down, by years of never giving up. They weren't looking for a fight. They were just looking to finish what they'd started. Nash's voice cut through the night. "We'll give them one chance to leave. After that, we fight." The riders stopped at the bottom of the ridge, their eyes scanning the shadows. The leader, a tall man with a dark coat, raised his hand. "We don't want trouble, Calder," he called out. "We just want the woman." Nash's hand tightened on the rifle, his gaze never leaving the leader. "You're not getting her," he said simply. The leader's eyes flicked between Elias, Nash, and Nora. He seemed to hesitate for just a second, but that was all it took. In an instant, everything erupted. The first shot rang out from Nash's rifle, the bullet flying through the air and hitting the rider's horse. The animal screamed and reared up, throwing the rider off balance. The chaos that followed was quick, brutal. Gunfire filled the air, echoing across the desert as the riders scrambled to take cover behind rocks and boulders. Nora's heart raced. She could feel the adrenaline surge through her body, sharpening every sense. She fired her rifle, aiming for the rider closest to her. The shot rang true. The man dropped to the ground, his body crumpling with a sickening thud. She didn't wait to see if he was dead. She didn't have time. Another rider tried to charge up the hill, but Elias was faster. He fired the shot, ringing out before the rider could even get close. He fell from his horse, the body tumbling down the rocky slope. Nash moved swiftly, his rifle in hand, as he covered them from the higher ground. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice steady. "Move, get to the border." Nora and Elias didn't need to be told twice. They ran, their feet pounding against the rocky ground as the last riders fell back. They could still hear the distant shouts, the sound of pursuit, but for now they were free. When they reached the ridge, Nora glanced back at the riders, dead or retreating she didn't know, and then at the horizon ahead. The border was just beyond the next pass. The first stars were fading into the morning light, and she could feel the weight of everything she had lost, everything she had fought for, beginning to shift. They had crossed into a new world now. There was no turning back. But as they descended the final hill toward freedom, Nora felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The kind of hope that came with knowing that for the first time she might actually make it out alive. And maybe, just maybe, she could stop running. They sat like that until the light turned honey and then thinned. The first stars pricked through. Somewhere in the yard, a seed took up water and decided to live. The chair moved a little on its runners and made a sound like someone breathing in their sleep. The ribbon at the window lifted and fell. The cabin held their quiet and kept it. The land held the promise without asking for more words. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.